A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
The idea of a ball four came to me after my first year in the minor leagues. I came back with all these funny stories about what a crazy life it was. And I said to my parents, I said, "Boy, somebody ought to write a book about this." I would spend all day long with a notepad in my pocket. I would fill it with notes, and sometimes I would fill almost a whole book with one day if it was a really good day. But then I'd run out of note paper, and I would write on whatever was available. If I was on an airplane, I'd write on an air sickness bag. If I was in the bullpen, I'd write on a popcorn box, peanut bags, airline tickets. I mean, I was constantly writing. I was a writing maniac.
When an excerpt of Bouton's book appeared in Lurked magazine, the response was decidedly negative.
The sports writers started writing these columns. Dick Young devoted like 4 consecutive columns in a row that what a terrible thing this was, these locker room secrets. The owners were furious.
Bowie Kuhn was the commissioner of baseball, comes out and tries to have the book banned, which is ridiculous. All it got was people wanting to read it.
Bowie Kuhn called me in for a reprimand. He wanted to stop the presses. He wanted to keep this book from being published. He didn't want anybody to read it.
It was bad judgment on his part. That there were things that were sacrosanct that ought to stay among the players and the managers and the coaches. And it just wasn't good form, good idea, good stuff. It was a bad thing to do. It was embarrassing.
Ball 4 quickly sold 50,000 hardcover copies, climbing the New York Times bestseller list. But in Major League locker rooms, Bouton was dead meat.
Do you know what the Yankee ball players did? They took Bouton's uniform, they threw it into the toilet and defecated on it. Did you ever hear that story?
What you hear here, what you see here, let it stay here when you leave here. Well, Bouton made the egregious sin of not leaving it in the clubhouse and taking it out and writing about it.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's do this, everybody. How are you? My name is Tim Hanlon, and this, of course, is Good Seats Still Available. It's the curious podcast that we do each and every week, despite all the odds against it, as we try to explore what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for coming by, and we appreciate you finding us, dialing us up, putting us in your earbuds, perhaps maybe during a little daily stroll outside to get some fresh air. Perhaps you are just bored to tears as you hunker down yourselves in your homes and your places of domicile. Maybe you're on a brief car ride to the grocery store or whatever else to get some supplies. Whatever it is you're doing, hopefully, to keep safe and healthy. We appreciate you allowing us to perhaps be a little bit of distraction and some background in the midst of just a world turned upside down. We hear you. We appreciate all your kind words. We've been overwhelmed, frankly, by the notes of gratitude and just people coming out of the woodwork, frankly, saying thank you or attaboy and thanks for this episode or that. And we greatly appreciate those comments. Of course, you can always keep sending those to hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com or visit the website and enjoy, perhaps, maybe for the first time if you're new to the proceedings, all of our great episodes that we've done so far. This is this is 161 of these episodes. I don't believe it. It's been a journey for sure, and but it's been great. We greatly appreciate your enthusiasm for it, and we're going to continue to do it as best as we can, despite all the circumstances. But regardless of the frivolity in front of you in this week and all of our various episodes, we encourage you to keep your eyes on the prize, and that is, of course, your health, your safety, and of course, by listening to your local authorities to ensure that you're doing what you should and, frankly, shouldn't be doing. Make sure that you follow all the rules and hang in there. We're in for a long journey, and nobody enjoys it for sure. But whatever you're doing to stay safe and healthy. And look, if you're a first responder or you're out there in the sort of world of mandatoriness because of your employer or what you do. Of course, a double thanks to you for all that you're doing to keep everybody else on the straight and narrow. This week, we are, if we can't play it, if we can't see it and watch it, we at least can talk about it. And that's baseball, of course. We should be in the midst of the earliest weeks of the season. Of course, we're not. We'll see what the rest of the spring and summer hold to see if we actually get some real baseball this year. But at least we can maybe go back a little bit into truly what used to be in this case, professional baseball. And as you heard in that clip, our guest this week, Mitch Nathanson, is going to take us back to the life and times of perhaps one of the more colorful modern characters in baseball history. His name was Jim Bouton, and whom we sadly lost about 9 months ago at the ripe old age of 80. A tremendous and interesting and maybe curious and largely unknown kind of story about the life and times of, I wouldn't call him sort of the all-time all-star in baseball playing history, of course, but you cannot deny Jim Bouton's role in the modern history of baseball, of course, not only for his playing days with the New York Yankees, quite the pitching phenom and an all-star for a season or two, the comebacks, of course, plural, both in the minor and the major leagues with the Atlanta Braves near the end of his career. But of course, that big, and for us, we love, of course, the excuse for the show, his 1 year or almost 1 year with the 1 year only team known as the Seattle Pilots in 1969. And we've gotten to that story a little bit in some previous episodes. But everybody, of course, will remember the exclamation point that Jim Bouton was absolutely remembered for, revered by some, reviled by others. Of course, that was the 1970 publication of the explosive book, Ball 4. Of course, a still to this day, seminal and outstanding book in baseball history, co-written and edited by his pal. We'll get into this conversation, part of the conversation in a few minutes. Leonard Schechter, he a newspaper writer who became friends with Jim during the course of Bouton's Yankee days. And frankly, his outspokenness. He was quite approachable to the press corps at the time. And for various reasons, Ball 4 was almost sort of the revelation, I guess, not only to the populace at large about sort of the inner workings or the sort of forbidden truths, I guess, of being a professional baseball player and all the craziness sort of around that. Jim Bouton's writings and his diary keeping was a breath of fresh air or just just an explosion of things that people weren't really knowing about baseball or talking about. And I guess on a smaller level or more micro level, it kind of birthed, I guess, sort of a renaissance of sports writing because it kind of gave license, this book did, and the excerpts from it and the subsequent revisions and follow-ups to it, updates to it, really was sort of a kind of a blueprint, frankly, and maybe an opening of gates to a little bit more of a straightforward and personable and frankly more detailed and underneath the surface kind of writing style that during the 1960s certainly wasn't the case in baseball. You could make the argument that a lot of baseball reporting at the time was still quite reverential, especially when it comes to the New York Yankees at the time, right? The sort of hallowed ground, I guess, and the heroes and the legendary figures that walked the hallways and traversed the greens of Yankee Stadium and frankly baseball generally. Jim Bouton kind of blew all that up, and we sort of get into not only that, which is certainly a big part of the story, but his year at the Seattle Pilots, how he got there in the first place, his career with the Yankees and the minors prior to that, the minors after that, the minors after leaving the Seattle Pilots, going to Houston, and then coming back actually in the minors as well as the majors, and frankly, just more generally, you could call Jim Bouton kind of the sports world's deceptive revolutionary. But as we get into our conversation with Mitch Nathanson in a few moments, I'm not too sure that people would sort of confuse Jim with a revolutionary. I mean, certainly those meeting him on the street or or whatever. This is a guy who created and loved all kinds of things around baseball, including something that's near and dear to my heart when I was a kid playing baseball and other sports, and that's Big League Chew. I didn't even know until I read this book, silly me, that Big League Chew, that sort of, I guess you'd call it sort of like chewable bubble gum that was sort of emulating that of chewing tobacco, right? But much more safe, of course. Just kind of ground up like it looked like. It didn't really look like it was pink, of course. Chewable tobacco, but it was chewable bubble gum. That was created by Jim Bouton, sort of as a way for kids to kind of experience a little bit of what it's like to kind of dip into a pouch, not of tobacco, but a bubble gum, and kind of maybe sort of align themselves and maybe aspirationally feel like they were playing at the pro level during their little league game. And I think that was kind of sort of it's kind of hard to sort of put it. I wouldn't put it impish. I wouldn't put it, a little bit of a curious kind of personality, maybe a tad bit whimsical, perhaps a little bit of, devilishness, but sort of in a good and maybe fun-loving kind of way. Jim Bouton was absolutely, as you'll hear in this conversation, a lover of the game of baseball, and his contributions to it, certainly in Ball 4 and in the literary world, certainly memorable, but in a whole bunch of other facets as well. And he was a darn good player, too, on a number of occasions, certainly as he was coming up through the Yankees franchise, and had some moments certainly there, too. But we get into all of that, the life and times of Jim Bouton with the author of the book of Jim Bouton, and frankly, I think now the quintessential biography. It's called Bouton, The Life of a Baseball Original, and it is written by our guest, Mitch Nathanson. Coming up in a couple of moments. This is a tremendous conversation. Truly, I learned a lot, and a bit unexpected in terms of what one learns about a baseball figure in Jim Bouton, certainly one to remember and one for the ages. We get to it in just a moment. But before we do so, of course, we want to say hello and welcome, of course, to one of our great sponsors. And this week, we spin the dial of intrigue, and it lands on our friends in beautiful Portland, Oregon. It's 503 Sports. Yes, the king of throwbacks. Our pal Dustin Alameda pulling it out there for us all at 503 Sports. And of course, the website is 503-sports.com. And a great way this week to celebrate the Seattle Pilots, the life of Jim Bouton, by going to 503-sports.com and dialing up one of three great Seattle Pilots offerings. There is, of course, T-shirts there, two of them. One is sort of the baby blue Pilots T-shirt with the original Seattle Pilots logo. That's very smart looking for sure. There is the red premium T-shirt version of the Pilots. It has the logo, and it's got the Seattle Pilots insignia there, but it's in red, which is sort of the third color of the original Seattle Pilots logo. So that's also very smart looking. And perhaps maybe the smartest looking of all is the beautifully handcrafted, custom made 1969 Seattle Pilots jersey, which bears the official 503 Sports logo for authenticity's sake. And you can get your number and your name on the back of it. It's fantastic, and it's truly a one-of-a-kind item. All of those and many, many more items in and around the realm of sports and throwbacks of such can be found at 503-sports.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you there, and that's the promo code SEATS, S-E-A-T-S. Spell it and use it often. SEATS, that's the promo code for 10% off all of your purchases at 503 Sports. And of course, again, that website is 503-sports.com, promo code SEATS, and that will ensure that you get 10% off everything you buy at the King of Throwbacks, 503 Sports. Thank you to Dustin for your continued sponsorship of the show. Thank you, listeners, for checking out 503 Sports and hopefully perhaps making a purchase. And thank you, of course, to everybody listening right now as we get into our conversation about the life and the legacy of Jim Bouton, a baseball pioneer on many different levels. Here's our conversation with Mitch Nathanson coming right up. Please, as always, enjoy. The whole zeitgeist of this silly little show has been sort of the excuse is to revolves around stories relating to either directly or indirectly, or frankly, squinting really hard about teams and leagues somehow evaporated and no longer with us, whether they be relocations or defunctness or glimmers in people's eyes that never sort of came about, whatever. We're sort of interested, I don't want to call it the folly, but sort of that used to be. And of course, in the history of Jim Bouton, right, who frankly was somebody when we thought about this show 4 or 5 years ago. Obviously, it was getting a little too late in Jim's life and his deteriorating health and all that. He would have been a perfect guest, and we would have loved to have gone deep with him on especially his Seattle Pilots experience. But there's a lot more to the guy than just the Seattle Pilots thing. So I suspect we'll get to that, of course, but before we do, how about a little background on you and why your interest in the story of Jim Bouton and perhaps a little bit into the story of the how and why you got into it in detail?
So I had written a book about Dick Allen a few years ago, and I didn't know much about Dick Allen, and learned that he was just this amazing iconoclast. And I found him fascinating. The next person I thought of was Jim Bouton. Because, when you want to one-up your game from Dick Allen, there's not too many places you can go. Jim Bouton might be the only guy that is more of an iconoclast than Dick Allen in baseball, at least. And so that naturally popped into my head. Although I have to say that I had Jim Bouton on my radar for many years. I had written something about him, about 20 years ago, and I met him, and I wanted to do something on him. But at that point, he was, he's a writer, so his response was always, "Well, why do I need you?" And then eventually, after he had his health issues, he didn't write much anymore, and he was more willing to talk. So that's kind of how that came about.
Well, okay. Well, what's with the iconoclastic sort of attraction in the first place, whether it be Messrs. Allen or Bouton, for that matter? What is the intrigue? I guess I'm going to guess it's because their stories tend to be a bit more colorful, maybe than the sort of plain vanilla sports hero.
Yeah. So when I looked at a guy like Allen, for example, the thing that intrigued me about it. Now remember, I hadn't grown up with Dick Allen, his prime. I remember Dick Allen from the 70s, and so when he came back to the Phillies in '75, as a kid, I just remember people were so polarized on this guy, and I didn't know much about him, and I wanted to know, well, why are people so polarized? And I just found that interesting. I don't know why I found that interesting. I just found it interesting that people had such strong opinions on both sides. And so that's how I got into that. And Bouton's the same way. I mean, Bouton is a guy who many people to this day have very strong feelings about. Ball 4 is not the scandalous book today that it was 50 years ago. But people still have strong feelings about what he did and whether he should have done it, and then other things in his life that people either rubbed people the wrong way or they thought it was just really cool. And I guess I'm just attracted to people who really bring out strong emotions on both sides. I'm not really that interested in pure heroes, and I'm not interested in pure villains. I like the people who are somewhere, in the middle, and people are staking out their claims on one side or the other.
Okay, but you're not a sports writer by trade, right? I mean, this is not your day job, No,
it's not my day job. So I teach at Villanova Law School. I teach writing, and I also I'm in their sports law center, and so this kind of, this sort of writing kind of, it's not an exact match, but it's not that far off. And so it's sort of hits a spot that's not quite down the center of the plate, I would say, but it might hit the black. And so still a strike. And so, as a professor, there's a scholarship aspect to my job There's teaching, service, and scholarship. And so the scholarship area, which I really found interesting, was this. And that's how that got started. I also write more. I write articles that have more of a legal bent to them as well. But the older I get, the more I'm drawn to this stuff rather than that stuff.
Well, okay. So, I mean, the whole Jim Bouton kind of story, right, is intriguing on a number of different levels. But I think a lot of people, frankly, like myself, although I didn't realize until I read your book that he actually lived for a couple of years in a town that I grew up right next door to, in Ridgewood, New Jersey. I'm a native of a town called Hohokus, which is right next door. I didn't know that he was in Ridgewood for a couple of years, but it's among many other sort of pieces of interesting information about sort of this life story. Maybe before we sort of get into, I guess, the Ball 4 sort of era, the Seattle Pilots as being sort of the jumping off point for the putting that book idea, at least in his head, together. Maybe a little bit of background about sort of Bouton as a kid becoming a baseball player, and interestingly, right out of the bat, essentially playing his first number of years, quite notably with the New York Yankees, literally in the shadow of his, or at least he was was born and initially raised.
So Bouton was always a fan, and that's the thing that's really interesting about him. A lot of professional athletes are not fans; they just have to be really good at what they do. And so, I think that for a lot of athletes, there's a disconnect between them and the people who watch the games, because the people who watch the games love the games. And I'm not so sure that many professional athletes really love what they do just for what they do. They're really good at it. And of course, if you're really good at something, you tend to have an affinity for it. But with Bouton, it was the other way around. Bouton was a fan, and he wasn't that good. That's the thing. He wasn't great. He was not the star of his high school team. He sat on the bench most of the time. He just really loved it, and I think that's the thing that sets him apart. That he was a fan. He always was a fan. I think at one point, he said, he's the first fan to actually ever take the field as a player. He was a person who loved baseball, but he was never a star, and so I think he came at the game very differently than a lot of other professional athletes came to it, and he never lost it. I mean, maybe there were other players who maybe they weren't great when they were younger, but they eventually became great, and their perceptions changed. Bouton's perception never changed. He always had this kind of boyish love for the game, and it never left him. And so I think that is why there are so many people who forget Ball 4, who loved him as a Yankee before Ball 4, because I think if you were a Yankee fan in the 60s and you looked down on the field, Mickey Mantle, who was still there at the time, I mean, he's a god. You might admire Mickey Mantle, but you couldn't see yourself as Mickey Mantle. But if you saw Jim Bouton, you see a guy who looks like he's given 180% out there. His hat flies off on every pitch. You could say to yourself, you know what? If I was going to be on the Major League field, I'd look like that guy. The guy who's just huffing and puffing and just giving it his all just to stay out there. And that's the attraction.
How does he even get on the Yankees' radar, right? Because he's, to your point earlier, he's not standing out per se as a high school player. He's got a partial scholarship at Western Michigan to play baseball there. How does he even get on the radar of a team that, at the time was, clearly in one of its many, eras of, amazingness and titled, runs in the Yankees?
If it wasn't for American Legion baseball, I don't think he would have ever been in the major leagues. When he couldn't play for his high school team, he played for a Legion team. This is in Chicago Heights, when his family moved to Indiana, Homewood, Indiana, and he played Legion ball in Chicago Heights. He was able to play Legion ball only because all of the players or most of the players on his high school team didn't play Legion ball. And so he could take the field and actually play, whereas he was sitting for most of his high school career. He eventually ended up playing for a coach who was a part-time scout for the Yankees. And as a matter of fact, the team that he played on was called the Chicago Yankees. This is his Legion team, and they used to wear old Yankee uniforms. The Yankees there wasn't really an affiliation, but this guy had some sort of relationship with the Yankees, and he had now this is a year before everybody was stamping the uniforms and selling them on eBay. The Yankees and all teams just handed their uniforms down, all the way down the line from one year to the next. And so they had a bunch of old uniforms, and they threw some at this coach. And so this team would take the field in old Yankee uniforms. In fact, this coach used to wear an old Phil Rizzuto uniform. And on that Legion team, Bouton really started to shine. And so it was the connection. So he was pitching well, and the coach was a part-time scout who was looking to become a full-time scout. And he's the one who got Bouton on the Yankees' radar. And so that's how he ends up with the Yankees. He signs for, you could call it a $30,000 bonus, but when you break down the numbers, it's not much of a bonus at all. Most of that money was going to be paid to Bouton should he make the major leagues, which, of course, most players don't. So it really wasn't much of a bonus, although I guess he could go home and tell his friends he got a $30,000 bonus. But that's how he ends up with the Yankees. After playing the Legion ball, and then he went to Western Michigan. And by the way, at Western Michigan, he only played on the JV team. He never played on the varsity. He played there for a year, and then after a year, he signed with the Yankees for that bonus, and then he started off in Class D ball. His father sent out a bunch of letters to teams to get them interested in his son. Most of those teams passed. A few teams had some mild interest. The Yankees had some interest only because of the relationship with this coach. And so that's how he ends up signing with the Yankees, which is in itself pretty unlikely, I think.
Did you talk to Art Stewart? It was still with us, by the way, I guess related to the Kansas City Royals, the guy, I guess, credited with making Bouton that offer to sort of join the Yankee organization. Did you get a chance to talk to Stewart?
Yes, I did.
What was his recollection of how and why Bouton got on his radar and why he made the move to bring him in?
He was great, by the way. He's 90 something at this point, and he's sharp as a tack. And he was the coach. He was the coach, the Legion coach. And he was the one who wanted the full-time job for the Yankees. It was because he signed Bouton that he ended up becoming a full-time scout for the Yankees. And then, as you say, he ended up with the Royals and had an incredible career, signed a lot of guys. Bouton was this guy who didn't throw hard, and then all of a sudden started to throw hard. And so that was the thing with Bouton. He talks about this in Ball 4 about learning the knuckleball off the back of the Wheaties box. That's because he was pretty small and he couldn't throw hard. But in high school, he grew a little bit and he could all of a sudden really throw hard. And that's what got him signed. It was not anything other than the fact that this kid had some real raw power. He had a big overhand curve and a good fastball. And at least for a few years, he had those things, and that's what got him signed. And that's the thing that Stewart presented to the Yankees, and that's what intrigued them, and that's how he ended up signing with them.
And what does that entail? Because this is 1959, right? And Bouton didn't get his first sort of cup of coffee with the Yankees upstairs until 62 or so, right? So what was his minor league trajectory, and how was he, I don't know, distinguishing himself, standing out, not standing out? Maybe you're alluding to some of it. It sounds like he's getting a little bit of, maybe he's growing into the pitching role physically, maybe control-wise, or some of the mechanics are finally coming together, perhaps, that eluded him earlier in his career.
Yeah, he threw hard, but he was really wild. He had a lot of wild pitches. He would hit batters, not on purpose, but he had a lot of trouble controlling anything that came out of his right arm. But he had power. He was a power pitcher, and so he was not a standout prospect. What really changed him was when he met Johnny Sane in spring training one year. And Bouton has always been a tinkerer. And I talk in the book about how he comes from a family of tinkerers, inventors, and things like that. And he always had a different pitch. He was working on a knuckleball. He was working on a palm ball, all sorts of pitches. And Johnny Sane, who was the pitching coach for the Yankees at the time, saw him in spring training and took him aside and took an interest in him and said, you got a couple of good pitches here, but you're throwing too many different types of pitches. You ought to go down, and I think he was going to Amarillo that year. He says, you ought to go down there and work on two pitches. And if you can get a fastball and a curveball over, you can make the team. But you're not going to make the team with 5 different pitches, which none of which you can control or master. That's what changed him. And when he's really started focusing on his 2 pitches, his fastball and his curveball. That's when he started to put things together. And as I said, that was really, Art Stewart got him to the Yankees organization, but it was Johnny Sane who got him to the Yankees. Without those 2 guys, he's still in Homewood, Indiana, I think.
So he comes up during the 62 season, right, which just happened to be yet another Yankees World Series championship season.
He made the team out of spring training in '62. So what happened was Casey Stengel had he started this instructional school that he would have for before spring training. He would have this kind of a pre-spring training camp for prospects of all levels in the Yankees farm system. Bouton got invited to that in '62, and he just dazzled everybody. And it was because he stood out in that. Now Stengel's gone by '62, but that instructional school is still there. And so Bouton dazzled him there. He ends up sticking around for spring training, regular big league spring training, which he was not supposed to do. And he pitched well in regular spring training, and then he made the team coming out of spring training. He didn't pitch a lot in the beginning of the year. So it might not have seemed as if he made the team out of spring training because he really didn't pitch a lot until he gets involved in an extra inning game and there's nobody else left, and he pitches several innings. I think it gets Detroit, I think. And then he starts opening some eyes.
Well, I guess I'm really curious as to sort of when does he start to kind of get his his credibility as being someone who can not only make the team but stick, and then even further then stand out. Obviously, I wasn't around at the time, and I'm a nominal Yankee fan growing up as a kid, and certainly aware of Jim Bouton, actually more for his television work at WCBS Channel 2 in New York as a sportscaster for some time in the 70s and 80s. But I guess how much of a quote-unquote sure thing was he? It didn't feel like he was, based on my reading of your book and other research, that he was necessarily going to be, let's say, an all-star in 1963, for God's sakes.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, he was a 500 pitcher in '62. He was kind of up and down. He started out in the bullpen. He got a start. He threw a shutout in his first, which he talks about in Ball 4. His first start, he was terrific, but then his next start, he wasn't so good. He was kind of up and down. The Yankees win the World Series in '62, and he doesn't play at all in that World Series. And so he's not. He certainly isn't a sure thing in '62. I mean, he's on the staff, but he's not going to get into a World Series game. It's '63, like you say, when he just has a breakout year, and it's a transitional time for the Yankees because the old guard is starting to get old, and the new guys are coming in, and so there's some openings, there's some possibilities to play, whereas maybe a couple of years earlier there weren't, and so he got a chance to pitch regularly, and he dominated. And that's how we broke out.
Yeah, and a bunch of World Series too, right? Not 62, but 63. I mean, he had quite a tete-a-tete with Don Drysdale, the Dodgers, and at Dodger Stadium, and in 64, and did fancied himself, he courted himself quite well, not only in World Series play, but consistent enough, right, to be not only a solid contributor and an all-star in 63, but also, maybe you can give us a little bit of sort of a sense of this, somewhat of a fan favorite too, right? I think you maybe hinted at sort of like maybe why, but maybe we can get a little deeper into that. Like why he just seemed to be that he was attractive to a lot of fans, especially, in that transitional period from sort of the old guard to the new guard. He's just seemed likable and maybe I'll throw a word out there, accessible or relatable.
So that's really important because the Yankees are like a button-down corporation. They're like a walnut boardroom. It's very buttoned down, and the players themselves they viewed the media as the enemy. Of course, Mickey Mantle's a star, but he could look right through you or just turn his back to you and not even acknowledge you if you were a reporter. But Bouton talked to anybody, and that was true with reporters and fans. And so I spoke to a bunch of fans who were Yankee fans in the early '60s, and they would hang out outside of Yankee Stadium to try to get autographs. And these are kids. And they said, I wanted Mickey Mantle. I wanted Whitey Ford. I wanted their autographs. And, once in a while they would stop and they might sign something, but they would never look at you, let alone talk to you. Bouton would not only sign, he would stop and have a conversation. And if you were there often enough, he knew who you were. He knew who your parents were. He would ask about them. He treated fans as though they were friends. And so he ends up with a fan club. 2 11, 12-year-old boys start this fan club. That gets written up in the paper and gives him a lot of good press for a Yankee. It's just not something a Yankee would do, right? You don't talk to kids. As weird as that sounds, that's not what Yankees did. I mean, Yankees, they just didn't do those things. But Bouton did. Fritz Peterson, he played for the Yankees a couple years later and later became Bouton's roommate, told me an interesting story about how to understand the Yankees. He said that at the end of the season, the traveling secretary would give everybody on the team the names and addresses of everybody else on the team. So you could keep in touch with them in the off season. And Whitey Ford pulled Fritz Peterson aside when he was a rookie, and he said to him, you're not allowed to send anybody a Christmas card until you've been here 5 years. And that was the Yankee way, right? So there's a strict hierarchy, and Bouton blew that right up. And Bouton didn't pay any attention to that. And as accessible as he was, that's how much he annoyed the old guard of the Yankees. They hated seeing him A, get the attention, and B, sort of court it a little bit. Not that he was an attention hog, but he just naturally drew people because he was gregarious. He would talk. Some of the research that I did, looking at old newspapers and things like that, it's amazing how many of those stories are essentially just written by Bouton. Not that he wrote them, but the reporter would just go sit down next to Bouton, and Bouton would explain what happened in the game. And this is when Bouton wasn't even pitching that day. And the good reporters didn't do that, but there's a lot of other ones. It's story after story. It's just one Bouton quote after another Bouton quote, and that is something you just don't see or you just didn't see, and that's why people liked him, and that's also why the old guard of the Yankees hated him.
In your research, would you characterize him as cerebral or just simply gregarious and people-oriented? What is the sort of, the psyche, of him relative not only to the team, but just in general? Because it's clear that he's got a personality.
Yeah, I wouldn't say he's cerebral, although that was his reputation. His reputation among other ball players was that he was always walking around with a book, and he was a deep thinker. He may have been a deep thinker, but he wasn't cerebral the way we would think of a person being cerebral. He was just a very gregarious. He was curious. He wasn't afraid of too many things, and so he would take some chances in terms of interests and hobbies and things like that maybe the rest of the ball players wouldn't do, because they thought, a lot of ball players they're just scared. And that's the thing that I found really interesting, both in doing the Allen book and this one, is how scared most ball players were. They were afraid of everything. They had a talent, and they were always afraid that they were going to wake up the next day and that talent would be gone. They were afraid to say anything because they were afraid that if they did, something could happen to them. This is, except if you were a superstar. But for the rest of them, they lived in a sort of, I wouldn't say fear, but it was a real hesitancy to say or do anything. I just think they felt their livelihood was precarious, and Bouton just wasn't like that at all. I mean, as I said before, Bouton thought all of this was just the most fun in the world, and to him it was a roller coaster ride, and he was going to be in the front car with his arms up, screaming his head off. That's how he viewed playing in the major leagues, which was not at all like 99% of the other players viewed it.
No, that's exceedingly interesting, because you hear that a lot in the entertainment field, right? Especially comedians when they're starting out and doing the stand-up thing, and you just, there's the fear, I guess, of or anxiety of performing, but there's a group of folks who kind of will look back on their careers, especially if they've been successful, and go, you know what, I didn't know what I didn't know. I was dumb, naive, stupid, fearless, had nothing to lose. And that, frankly, that kind of mindset can actually set one up for, being impervious to lots of different sort of threats and challenges or perceptions of maybe losing a talent or whatever, because you're aligned with the activity. You're enjoying the process of entertaining, or in Jim Bouton's case, playing. And to your point earlier, right, the idea of being a fan, if you will, first, maybe almost it's almost sort of like boyhood rationale for being a ball player in the first place. It's almost like he didn't shake that, even as he ascended to the top levels, playing in big, World Series games.
Yeah, he was just a different character. I mean, you just didn't see a guy like that in a major league locker room, or if you did, you didn't see him for very long. And I think, and you didn't see him at all on a team like the Yankees. You just never saw that. And he for many people, he was just a breath of fresh air in what was becoming seen as an increasingly stodgy game. And so I think it's not just him, it's the times. I think that he came along at a time where maybe people were more willing to embrace that. Maybe they wouldn't have embraced that so much a decade earlier, but things are loosening up a little bit in the 60s, and baseball certainly wasn't, but Bouton was. And so maybe if you were a younger fan in the 60s and you looked at Major League Baseball, there wasn't a lot there that you could perhaps identify with. But Bouton you could identify with. Bouton seemed to be a guy who had sort of a younger outlook mindset, as opposed to most of these guys who were coming off the farm and really, they just didn't have much to say. They didn't have much perspective. They played ball, and that was it. And again, Bouton's a city kid. Bouton's different. He's smart. I mean, I said he was cerebral. He's not cerebral, but he's smart. He's very smart, and you couldn't fool him. And I think that's what separated him from everybody else, and I think that's why people liked him. They saw something. If you were younger, when you saw the Yankees, you saw a guy on the field that, hey, I can relate to this guy. I like this guy. And I think that carried him a long way. And that I don't see another reason why he stuck with the Yankees as long as he did, because he struggled for a few years after those couple of good ones where I think if he was not Jim Bouton, he would not have been there.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that, because he was arguably sort of something like of a phenom, in 63, 64. But at 65, it seemed to kind of go wobbly, I guess. I guess as was hinted in your book and some other things that I've read, they were using him a lot. I think he had more starts that year than anybody in 64 than anybody in Major League Baseball. Obviously extended by some World Series and the playoff stuff, but 37 starts and it's lesser mortals would be shut down earlier than that these days.
Yeah, if you look at now there were guys who started as many games as he did. You look at the number of starts pitchers had back then, and they started a lot of games. He started a lot of games, but he also had a delivery that just always looked painful. It was not a smooth delivery. He didn't look like Carlton's a lefty, but he didn't look smooth like Steve Carlton looked. He looked like a guy who was going to hurt his arm, and he did hurt his arm. He had this, like I said, he had a big overhand curve, and I don't see how you can watch a guy throw like that and not say to yourself, this is a guy who's going to throw his arm out, which is what he did. It didn't take him long to throw his arm out either, because, like I said, he didn't throw that hard for very long. He was not a hard thrower throughout much of his high school career, and by his early 20s he threw his arm out. So, a few years where he could throw hard, and I think the reason he threw his arm out is because of that delivery. That just it gave him more velocity than he otherwise would have had. It got him to the big leagues, but there's no way you can throw like that and have a long career. This is just not going to happen.
All right. Well, there are a couple of things going on around that time, and one of which I kind of want to get into because this leads into the big supernova that becomes Ball 4 and the 69 Seattle Pilots. But who is this Leonard Schechter guy who, I guess by all accounts, Bouton sort of became friendly with? It seems to me like that's sort of the one of the key kernels here to what leads up, not only baseball-wise, but also literary-wise to come.
Schechter was a columnist for the New York Post, and he took a liking to Bouton right away. So probably people who listen to your podcast, I'm sure a fair amount of them know who the Chipmunks were, who were this group of reporters who were young, kind of, if you're thinking of the literary sports writer equivalent of a Jim Bouton, it would be these guys, the Chipmunks, who were younger sports writers, mostly New York-based, New York and Philadelphia, really. And they took a different approach to sports writing than the generation before them, which was a little more staid. And Leonard Schechter was really Leonard Schechter and Stan Isaacs and Larry Merchant, I would say, would be the three guys who were on the vanguard of the Chipmunk brigade. And they wrote more about the players as personalities. They were interested in what they did when the games were over. They weren't so much interested in how many games you won and how many games you lost as if you were an interesting person, if you're an interesting character, if there were interesting stories that surrounded you. So Bouton was made for this. He was really their guiding light. And Schechter really noticed something in Bouton right off the bat. And can I curse on this podcast?
Absolutely. No? We encourage it.
Okay, well, that's good. So Bouton told me that when he first showed up, when he makes the team in 62, a player pulled him aside and tried to tell him the facts of life and of playing baseball in New York, and pointed out, you got to be careful of the media, and particularly this fucking Schechter. And he said Bouton told me more people pulled him aside and told him to watch out for fucking Schechter. And he said, after a while, I thought that must have been his first name, since that's all anybody referred to him as. And so he says, then he meets the guy, and he says he looks like a walrus. He's got these big bug-eye glasses and a big mustache and, pudgy guy. And Bouton is like, this is the guy that everybody's afraid of. Mickey Mantle's afraid of this guy. He couldn't believe it. Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford would run into the showers when fucking Schechter showed up, and you see fucking Schechter, and he looks like somebody's uncle. And so Schechter and Bouton hit it off right away and became friendly. Schechter was the one who wrote about Bouton's fan club, all about Bouton, with the two kids that I mentioned earlier who used to hang out outside of Yankee Stadium getting autographs. And Schechter is the conduit between Bouton and the general public. And he's, just by watching Bouton, you could kind of get a sense of who he was. But it was really Schechter and Schechter's stories on Bouton that really let people see who Jim Bouton was as a person. And that is what really led to a lot of the connection that people had to him. One interesting thing about Bouton that Schechter wrote about, which just blew me away, was when he was pitching in Yankee Stadium, and if he had a bad outing and he got knocked out of the game early, he would go back into the clubhouse, he'd take a shower, he'd change, and then he'd go sit in the stands for the rest and watch the rest of the game from the stands. So you would be watching a game, and you could very well have ordered a hot dog, and the guy passing you the hot dog is the guy who started the game an hour and a half earlier. And so it's stuff like that that really connected Bouton to the Yankee fans. And Schechter is the guy who wrote about it. And Schechter is the guy who made Jim Bouton accessible as he was through his columns. And so Schechter and Bouton became friendly. On the plane, when the media, the sports writers would travel with the team, after a while, Bouton decided he would rather sit with the writers than his teammates, and particularly Schechter. And so Bouton and Schechter became close. But as they became close, Bouton became more of an outsider to his teammates, who saw him as the enemy, just like they saw Schechter as the enemy. And so Bouton's relationship with Schechter helped him, obviously, as it turned out, when it came to ball 4, but it really hurt him with his teammates, who thought he was somewhat of a spy. Every time there was a story that mentioned something about one of the ball players, they thought that piece of information was being fed to them by Bouton. It usually wasn't, but that's what they thought anyway.
So this gets interesting. So what I really want to get into then is now the idea of a book, right? And the whens and wheres of that sort of coming about, because now I'm getting the sense that this could have contributed to Bouton's being unprotected when the expansion draft came about for the upcoming 1969 season. Do I have that right, or am I conflating events?
Well, Bouton was traded before that.
Sorry.
So he got sent down to Syracuse because he had struggled for a number of years. So he had 63 and 64, and then by 65 he was already a shot pitcher. And so you're looking 65, 66, 67, and by 68, it's his fourth season where he just can't win consistently, or even get on the mound consistently. And sports writers outside of the Chipmunks, the Chipmunks had their own rivals, the older guard, and the sort of sports writers who were kind of really protectors of the Yankee flame, who didn't like the Chipmunks because they thought that the Chipmunks were piercing that. They would always wonder, well, why is Bouton still around? Why is this guy still here? And the reason he was there, I think, was because he was a personality. And the Yankees in the late '60s were terrible, and Bouton was one of the few people that people would want to see. Mickey Mantle had retired, and so Bouton is he's still, because he's being written about by Schechter and the other George Vesey and other Phil Pepe and Stan Isaacs and all these other columnists in New York. He's a draw, but by 68, that's not enough. And he gets sent down. He goes up and down a couple of times, and then eventually he gets traded to I think he gets traded officially to the Angels minor leagues system, but that team was in Seattle. It was I believe it was an Angels AAA club in '68, but the whole idea was it was being populated to be the expansion, to at least be a bunch of guys you could take to spring training in '69 as the expansion Seattle Pilots. That's how he ends up in Seattle, not because they wanted him, by the way. I think that's an important point. The Pilots didn't really want him either. He's just a dude filling out a uniform that they could bring to Tempe, Arizona in '69 and be a body who can throw perhaps for a few weeks to somebody else. That's the only reason he ends up with Seattle.
Okay, that's especially interesting. So when does the book idea come into being? It seems like it was germinating before him ultimately getting a spot with the Pilots come '69 post spring.
Yeah, he had actually started writing pieces for Sport magazine a couple of years before that. He had written a couple of things. And it's interesting when you go through them. And I was fortunate to speak with Al Silverman, who was I think he was the editor-in-chief of Sport back then. I think he's died since then, but I was lucky to talk to him about Bouton, and he told me that he was always a big fan of Bouton, and he thought that Bouton was a smart guy, and he encouraged Bouton to write. And so Bouton's first real piece is a piece in Sport magazine in '67, '68 about him being sent down to the minors. And if you read that piece, it is the grandfather of Ball 4. It is the same tone. It is the same. Really, it takes you inside the locker room in the first sentence. And it really gives you a feel of what it's like to be told you're being sent down to Syracuse. I think that piece begins with Bouton talking about how you're not making the team when you see all the bags on the bus except for yours, and yours is still sitting in your locker. They never tell you that you're not going north with the team. You're sticking behind. And so right away you see that's a different sort of a piece. And so he had always wanted to write something. He starts to write some stuff for Sport, a couple of things. He wrote something on the Mexico City Olympics. And his mother had always told him he should write a book because he had so many interesting and funny stories. Every year he would come home and tell his parents about them. But his idea was he was going to write a book after he became a star. And by '69, it's clear that's not happening. And he decides that, well, if I'm ever going to write this book, this seems to be my last shot in Seattle. And that's when he gets serious about it. Not because he's a star, but because he knows it's either now or never. And so that's when he really starts to take it seriously. And that's also, coincidentally, when Len Schechter approaches him and asks him if he wants to work together with Schechter on a book, which, by the way, is a book that his publisher doesn't want, which is another interesting story because, when Schechter approaches Bouton, this is in the end of after the '68 season, Bouton's in the minor leagues at that point. And so he's not Jim Bouton, the superstar New York Yankee. He's Jim Bouton, the minor leaguer out in Seattle, Northwest America, who is an outside shot to even make the Pilots. And even if he makes the Pilots, who's going to see him? This is not the template for a bestseller. A ball player playing in the middle of nowhere, just writing about his thoughts about being at the end of the line. His publisher, which was World Publishing, did not want this book. They wanted Schechter, but they wanted Schechter to work with somebody else. Schechter insisted on Bouton, however, because of his relationship with Bouton. Schechter had written a book about a decade earlier. He'd written a book with Roger Maris, and it was a nightmare of a relationship. Maris was a pretty sour guy, and Maris and Schechter just did not get along and actually stopped talking to each other halfway through the season. Schechter did not want to do that again. So when World approached him to write another book, Schechter's response was no, but if I'm going to do it, I would only do it with Jim Bouton, and which World was not thrilled with, and it took a lot of convincing to get them on board with that idea.
So when does the book sort of come into play? I mean, does he go into his pilot season now, having made the team, with this in mind, or is it just coincidental that the book idea was rattling around, and it just so happened to be he was in Seattle for a bulk of the year, and this was just the tableau upon which he was sort of going to do this book?
Well, they worked out a deal with World in the winter between 68 and 69. So they had a book deal, not a lucrative book deal, but they had a book deal. And so, yes, going into spring training in 69, Schechter, Bouton, and World were all on board for this book, which, truth be told, World did not think that book was ever even going to get written, because they didn't think Bouton was going to either he wasn't going to make the team, he wasn't going to stick, or even if he stuck, who would even care? And so World was so convinced that this book was not going to go anywhere that they actually made a backup deal with Bill Freehan, who was a catcher for the Detroit Tigers. And that's the kind of guy they wanted in the first place. So Bill Freehan wrote a book, Behind the Mask, and World signed. That book was being. It's a long story, but it was actually being published by Dick Schaap's imprint, and World worked out a deal where they would distribute it because they wanted something to have on their spring 1970 list. They wanted a baseball book. And they were not confident that Bouton's book was ever going to see the light of day, so that's how they ended up with two, as it turned out. Although they thought really they were only going to have the Freehan book, but they did walk. Going back to your question, Bouton and Schechter did have a book deal going into 1969. Whether it was going to turn into anything, who knew? But they did have a book deal.
All right. So my two branched questions now, maybe in succession, is take us through a little bit of the 69 season as Bouton sort of expounds upon it, because it obviously doesn't last for the entire season because it's back down to the minors by the end of it. And then maybe we can get into 1970 when the book is finally ready to go, published, and then the reaction to that. But I think it would be helpful for our audience, especially those youngins out there who've never read or have only peripherally heard of Ball 4, maybe to get a sense of what he's talking about in this book, or what he's documenting, I guess, or journaling as part of the process during the Seattle Pilots experiment. Because, not only his career and his last chance, if you will, at the majors and all that kind of stuff, and the ups and downs and all the sort of things in his head about sort of baseball generally and how to write about it. But look, there's an adventure around the Pilots too, right? Comical and not so. The fact they only lasted a year is, legendary in baseball history.
Right. So one of the things that Bouton stressed to me about this was that he did not think he could have written this book while he was with the Yankees, because it's a completely different atmosphere. He said the Pilots were so unique because he said, yes, he was at the end of the line, but everybody was at the end of the line. The only reason you would be on the Pilots is if you either had never made it or you were a falling star. Nobody there was on the way up. And so he said it was interesting because you have all these players with all these hard luck stories. All of them have pasts. None of them are phenoms. And so you get all these players in one spot. And he said you don't get that anywhere else. All these players they're all looking into the void in one respect or another, which is just something you don't see on the Yankees, and you don't really see anywhere. You would only see it on a team like the Pilots in 69, a team that exists only because everybody else has given them their rejects, and the players know their rejects. And in a way, you can have some sad stories, some heart-wrenching stories, but you also get a lot of really funny stories. You get a lot of players who really don't feel like they have as much to lose, perhaps, as maybe players who are on the Yankees. I mentioned earlier that a lot of ball players are scared, or they were scared. Not so much on the pilots, because these guys had been through a lot. They knew that this was the end or near the end, and they were a little looser, and they were a little freer, and they were they were themselves. And so what Bouton would take it all down and document it, all the funny stories, the sad stories, the interesting stories, the hard-ass stories, particularly when you're being managed by an old-school hard-ass guy like Joe Schultz, who just has a tough time understanding what's going on outside the stadium gates in 1969. All of it is like it's a cavalcade of contrasts and misperceptions and failures, and you put it all together. If you have an eye, you need an eye for this too. If you have an eye such that you can spot this and you can see it, it's a great book. If all you see is just a bunch of guys who are going to be on a last place team, maybe it's boring, but that's not what Bouton saw, and that's not the book that ended up being written.
Yeah, because some of this is curious as to how much of this is the pilots projecting upon baseball, and how much of this is baseball generally projecting upon the situation that is the pilots, right? Because it's clear that, that Schechter and he are talking about some kind of, year in the life or season in the life of whatever, right? Even before he's ensconced in the pilots' luminary lineup there, right? But it also seems like it's somewhat, convenient too, because there seem to be some bigger themes and some bigger observations that are not just specific to the pilots that year, but to baseball generally beyond the Pacific Northwest.
Right. There's big themes in that book, and there's you have this insular world of baseball going up against this larger world where things are changing, and a lot of the book plays off of that, the old ways versus the new ways, baseball having trouble dealing with youth culture. There's a lot in that book. There's a lot in Ball 4 about the coaches getting on players because their hair's too long. You got to cut your hair. But there's a couple of parts in the book where he talks about how, if you get 3 hits, you don't have to get a haircut. But if you're going to strike out, you better make sure you got a crew cut. It's a lot of weird psychology and just approaches to the world where you just see how much, Bouton might be a fish out of water in baseball, but baseball's a fish out of water in America that period of time. I mean, baseball is a weird place in 1969. If you look at it compared to what's going on in the world. And I think one of the things that Ball 4 does is it really shows you that. It shows you a lot of the pettiness, the vindictiveness, the baseball living in a world that just doesn't really exist anymore anywhere outside of baseball. And I think Bouton does a really good job of getting that across. He also gets a lot across about the vindictiveness of management directed towards players, which will then become a big deal in the next few years as the Players Association and Marvin Miller start to push against that structure. It was hard. It certainly is hard to see from 1969 that in just a few years the whole structure is going to be upended, because it doesn't seem like it's going to be. But when you read Ball 4, you can see why that would happen, because you can see how management is taking advantage of players, and how players are starting to push back a little bit, which is interesting because most ball players, they're pretty they're a pretty conservative type, and yet they would push back against management unexpectedly, I think. And I think that's if you read it now, you can really see the line between Ball 4 and free agency in Major League Baseball. You probably couldn't see that in 1970 when the book came out, but you can see it now.
Well, it's also interesting too, because I mean, you're hinting at it, right? It's also, you say baseball's in a weird place, right? The country is in a weird place, right? It's the tumultuous late 60s, right? This is a small microcosm, I guess, and of just transitional parts of life overall, not just baseball, right? Sports generally, and culture and society, hair length, right? I mean, all of that you could superimpose some of those issues into this story just as much as the ills of the insular world or the curiosities of the insular world of baseball.
Yeah, it's a funny. I spoke to John Thorne for the book, and he's the official historian for Major League Baseball.
Sure,
He made
legend in his own time, of course.
Yeah. And he made a really great observation. He said one of the things that really makes Ball 4 work is that you have Joe Schultz as the manager, who, in our mind as readers, we see Joe Schultz as embodying everything we thought baseball was like in the 30s and the 40s. You see Joe as portrayed within Ball 4. You could imagine, Thorne says, you could imagine Joe Schultz, drinking beer with the Babe, and you put him in the same locker room with Jim Bouton, who is, as another sports writer I spoke to, George Vesey, told me, Bouton is the 60s before the 60s knew they were the 60s. You put those two guys in the same locker room, you cannot help but have fireworks and a clash of culture that is explosive. And that's a lot of what Bouton captured. And it's not just Bouton and Schultz, but it's a lot of old school rubbing up against change and how uncomfortable that is for both sides. And I think that's what gives the book a lot of life. And I think even when you read it now, it still has life for that reason.
Oh, it still holds up. It certainly helps to know sort of the times and the situations around it, but it still holds up for sure, even without that on a bunch of different levels. So let me ask you then, how does the book come out, right? So Bouton's, he's basically sent down to the minors of, I guess, the Houston Astros. He's traded to the Astros, and then he goes down, I guess, to another minor league team in the process. And it seems like that, he kind of maybe recognizes that this is probably, kind of near the end of the line, although he does come back in 70 a little bit. But tell us about sort of the book coming out, because that comes out, June of 70 or so? Kind of almost in the beginning of the first third, I guess, of the baseball season?
Yeah, so before the book comes out, there are excerpts in Look magazine, and those come out at the very end of May. And coincidentally, they come out while the Astros, Bouton's with the Astros now, they come out while the Astros are in New York playing the Mets. And it's just, it's as if a
coincidence, or was that planned?
I think it's a coincidence. I think it's a coincidence. And now, I should add that the sports editor of Look magazine is none other than Len Schechter. So Schechter, Schechter is really pulling the strings here in a lot of different ways. The reason he gets the excerpts in Look magazine, obviously, is because Schechter has the power to do that, but also because World refused to promote the book because they had a switch in editors, and the new editor didn't want to promote the book. He tried to bury it and move the release date off to November, where baseball books don't sell very well when they come out in November. And so Schechter really took the reins and put the PR machine that he could put into place. That's how we got those excerpts into Look magazine in late May, and that set off the firestorm. World was only going to publish, I think, 10,000 copies of that book, but Schechter did enough talking the book up to his friends, who then put it in their columns, that there's the kissing scene, and then Mickey Mantle's drunk, and all these sorts of things. Schechter picked the most salacious parts of the book and put those all in the excerpts, and told all of his friends about it, so they would put it in their columns, so that when the book when the excerpts, forget not the book, when the excerpts get released in late May, and if you read the excerpts, it's every Greenies, drunk Mickey Mantle, Elston Howard scuffing the ball up for Whitey Ford, all these sorts of things. The beaver shooting on the Shore Motel in Washington. All of that stuff is in the first excerpt. And it's like a bomb exploded. And once the bomb exploded, World, as much as it didn't want to publish the book, started upping its print runs. And by the time the book comes out in June, people are dying to read it because they've either read the excerpt or they've read their local sports writer either talking about how this is going to be the best thing in the world or the worst thing in the world. And so, yeah, the excerpt is what made Ball 4 infamous, I would say. If there were no excerpts, it probably wouldn't be as infamous. But it's the choice of putting certain things in that's what really got people's attention initially. And that's what made it, I think, as hot as a hot potato as it was, and it made Bouton a hot potato right off the bat. He had to go in and see Bowie Kuhn, who wanted him to renounce the whole thing and say it was all a bunch of lies, which Bouton wouldn't do, which only helped sell the book even more. Bowie Kuhn kind of reminds me of George Costanza from Seinfeld. Whatever instincts he had, he should have done the opposite. Every step of the way, he did the wrong thing, and by doing the wrong thing for Bowie Kuhn, he made Ball 4 a huge bestseller. And as Bouton's always said that he couldn't have made Ball 4 what it was without Bowie Kuhn, and he's right about that.
So describe the dichotomy of the reaction, because obviously, in the general public, it was an immediate sensation, perhaps through the PR efforts of Schechter, smartly revealing pieces of it. But he's also, though, quickly, if not abruptly, becomes a persona non grata within the baseball family, right?
Right. I thought it was really interesting when I was going through the reactions at the time to the book, and I had a lot of preconceptions as to what I thought the reactions would be, and I was wrong on every count. What I found was that people's reactions to the book varied depending upon how dependent they were on baseball. So most sports writers trashed the book outside of the Chipmunks. The Chipmunks loved it. As I said, Bouton was their guiding light, and Schechter they all looked up to. So they wrote about it very positively. But outside of the Chipmunks, traditional sports writers, I'm talking Dick Young and Jimmy Cannon and all of the other, every city has their own, local legend, traditional sports writer who's really has a close affiliation with the team. They hated it. And the reason they hated it, I really believe, is because they were touting themselves as the insiders to their readers. And they would always tout themselves as the person you needed to go to if you were a sports fan. You needed to go to them to be told what's going on in the locker room and what's going on here and what's going on there. What Bouton's book did was it showed readers that these guys weren't telling them everything that was going on. And I think he hurt their credibility, or at least they felt their credibility was being attacked, because when you read Ball 4, you read a whole world. You read about a world that was taking place under the nose of your local sports writer who did not write one word about it. And I think that those sports writers felt they were scooped, and they felt that they were deceived, and I think they were angry, and so they lashed out against Bouton. Ball players, again, who are part of the firmament of Major League Baseball, they viewed it as attacking Major League Baseball. And again, as I said before, most of these guys are scared. They took it as an attack because they took it as an attack on their livelihood. They also didn't like the fact that he told locker room stories about some of them because they knew that they were going to have to go home and answer to their wives. And so, yes, they may not have shown up in Ball 4, but they knew that after Ball 4 came out, they were going to have to go home and explain to their wife, well, yeah, that may have been what happened to this guy, but I didn't do any of those things. And they knew that that's a tough conversation that they're going to have. And most of them knew that they probably weren't going to be able to get away with it. So I think that's why ball players didn't like it. But if you got away from that and you look at the larger literary world, general reviews like in the New York Times Book Review and the Washington Post, people who are reviewing it who are not sports writers, they loved it. They loved it because it was a real insider's look at Major League Baseball and the life of a Major League Baseball player and a peek inside the locker room, a real peek inside the locker room, not the curated look that you got from Dick Young or from your local sports writer. They loved the book. And I think most fans love the book because they want to know the inside story. They assumed they were getting the inside story, and then when Ball 4 comes out, they realized they weren't getting the inside story, but here's the inside story. So it was a real split. The closer you were to Major League Baseball, the more you disliked it. But the further away you got, you appreciated it because A, it was wonderfully written, and B, it's funny, it's raunchy, it's insightful, it makes you cry, it makes you laugh. It's everything you want from a book, and that's why the response was so positive by people who didn't feel like they were being attacked by the mere fact of the book being released.
Yeah, it's interesting. It almost feels like on the sports writer front, you mentioned Dick Young. It seems like he was on a lot of different fronts, always leading the way of curmudgeonliness or irascibility and old guard. It almost feels like this was sort of the final nail, I guess, in the coffin of the old guard, I guess, of sports writers, and this is almost sort of the confirmation, I guess, of the new guard and the sort of the journalism of the times, if you will, right? A more straightforward and personality based and beyond the veneer, I guess, of the old ways of covering not only baseball but sports generally. But I also get the sense too that there were a number of players that sort of stood out, I guess, as being especially irritated. I know Pete Rose had a colorful quote or two about I'll let you tell it, but also too Mickey Mantle, right? There are a couple of parts of the book that are especially harsh about Mantle, and maybe we could argue as to whether that should have been said or not. But this was a quote unquote hero of Yankee lore, and it seems like that relationship was, I guess, for years afterwards. I guess strained is too light a word for it between Bouton and Mantle.
Yeah, Mantle was a legend because he was written about as a legend. I mean, he was a great hitter. He was a great player. No question. He's one of the all-time greats. But he was a drunk and he was a jerk. And pretty much every player I spoke to who played with Mantle in the 60s said that he wasn't always a drunk and he wasn't always a jerk, but he could be. He could be a very good teammate. He could be a friendly guy when he wanted to be, but then he would go into Mickey Mantle mode and he could be a nasty guy. And if you're going to write about Mickey Mantle, what are you going to write? I mean, I think that the accepted approach is that you take the hero as he's portrayed, and you don't try to pop that bubble. But Bouton didn't see him. Bouton actually liked Mantle because, as I said, he wasn't always a jerk and he wasn't always drunk. He was, he could be a great teammate. Even Bouton said that. But he saw a lot of times where Mantle could just be nasty. And so he thought that was important too. And, it's, I guess if you need your heroes, you don't like that. But as Bouton said to me, well, I thought it made Mantle more interesting. I didn't think he was very interesting as the cartoon character he was portrayed as being. I thought he was more interesting as a human being with flaws like everybody else. I mean, now we know Mickey Mantle had a tough childhood. He had an abusive father. And so did he, there's a reason why he drank, and maybe there's a reason why he could be so nasty. And maybe it's better to understand those things, to understand who he is, rather than build him up as a cartoon character where
he just doesn't seem relatable and human. This goes back to the first thing I was saying in the beginning, where you could watch Mickey Mantle play in the early '60s and the '50s, but you couldn't relate to him. After Ball 4, you could relate to him, and particularly after other books that came out subsequently. Once Ball 4 broke the dam, and people were writing about players, particularly players like Mantle, more honestly. If you read Jane Levy's book on Mantle, which is terrific, you start to understand more about Mickey Mantle. I mean, you might not like him, but you understand him. And I think, to me at least, as a baseball fan, I appreciate that more than just this cartoon character that I can't relate to a cartoon character.
Well, I think it's lost on the current generation, right? That these kids today, right? Besides staying off my lawn, the idea though is that this book was a watershed in call it sports journalism or memoir or whatever. It's not just frankly about changing how baseball sort of gets looked upon and understood and described, right? But just sports writing generally, and maybe frankly just almost genre neutral, if you will, beyond just sports, about how I won't call it tell-alls, but it certainly did change the nature of what about reporting and memoirs, I guess, just generally. I think people don't sort of recognize just how powerful and impactful this book was and its legacy beyond just a year in the life of a baseball player.
Yeah, it wasn't the first tell-all either. That's the other thing that people don't realize, that this was a form of a book before Jim Bouton wrote Ball 4. This sort of a book kind of started with Jim Brosnan in the early '60s, where he wrote a diary, and that book's a good book. That book holds up too. It's an interesting book to read, but Jim Brosnan's kind of a straight up guy. I think he would drink a martini every once in a while and smoke a cigar, but you kind of learn more than you thought you knew about the players. And then there was this instant replay about the Jerry Kramer and the Green Bay Packers, and that was another diary form, and that was a big seller, and that's how this type of book really became popular, and why World Publishing wanted a book, another baseball book, because these types of books were becoming popular. But there was a limit to what was revealed in these books, and it wasn't until Ball 4 where the books really got real. You learn some things in instant replay, and you learned a few things in even Bill Freehand's book. You learned that Denny McClain was kind of a jerk and liked to fly his plane and didn't really care about his teammates, but you didn't really learn really what it was like to be a Major League Baseball player, all the warts and everything, until you read Ball 4, and that's what makes it groundbreaking. And then after Ball 4, there was just a ton of these books. Most of them were not very good, but there was just this idea that now we have to tell everything, which is so amazing that before Ball 4, it was, we don't want to tell anything. And within a year, it was, well, you have to tell everything. And if you're not going to tell everything, then we don't want to know about it. And that's why a lot of the books that came out after Ball 4, they didn't really make much of an impact, because they were tawdry without being interesting. I read one review, which I thought was funny. Bo Belinsky, who pitched in the '60s and was known as a ladies' man and things like that, and he writes after Ball 4, these books just pop up like dandelions. And Belinsky's book is called, I think, Pitching and Wooing, and it's all about him, with one starlet after another. And the review that I read said, after reading Ball 4, I didn't realize how interesting baseball could be, but after reading Pitching and Wooing, I didn't realize how boring sex could be. So, that shows you that, you have to have a talent for this. It's not just, here's like Chico Escuela, here's bad things about the Mets. You need more than that. And very few books have been able to really duplicate that, or at least approach that. Although a lot of them have tried, and there's just been no end of them.
It's stuff like Dave Megacy's book, Out of Their League, on the football side of things, right? The St. Louis Cardinals, and that was sort of in that sort of vein and around the same time as well. Somebody, frankly, we've reached out to kind of sort of get into that too, because the St. Louis Cardinals and pro football and all those sort of things. So, but it does speak to, again, sort of the genre bending, if you will, or redefining. So let's round third base here, because we could go way deeper into sort of the post, Bouton career and all that stuff afterwards. There are two questions one question before we sort of get to that, as sort of maybe our slide into home plate, if you will, to completely string an analogy. What was Bouton's reaction himself to all of this? Was he amused? Was he bemused? Was he expecting this? Was it more than he expected? And then, frankly, how did he, it's interesting. It seems like he almost, I don't know, I want to say predestined, but opportunistically rode that wave for the rest of the 70s, career-wise, both, back in baseball a couple of different times, but also, frankly, successfully and notably outside of baseball, right? This was almost a career changer for him in many respects, and I guess financially to the upside, too.
Yeah, if you think, just to think about how different the times were, once Ball 4 came out, he was making more money as a writer than he was making as a ball player. Now, that's not going to happen today. But that book sold so well that he could afford to leave baseball because he was making more money not playing baseball. And so, yeah, that really it's a life changer for him. He was always, as I said in the beginning, I was drawn to iconoclast, and he was always an iconoclast. But then he became a professional iconoclast once that book came out. That was your go-to guy. If you wanted to get, the word of the iconoclast, you went to Jim Bouton, and that's how he ended up becoming a sports reporter, first on for WABC and then WCBS. He just was a unique individual. He was always a unique individual, but then, as you say, he rode that, and he was just different as a profession. I think that's the best thing you could say, as a sportscaster as well, that he just was different. I spoke to Keith Olbermann about Bouton as a sportscaster, and Olbermann told me that he modeled his sports centers of the 90s after Jim Bouton's sportscasts of the 70s on Channel 7 and Channel 2. And he said, yeah, I've been ripping off Jim Bouton since ever since I started doing SportsCenter, because Bouton was a guy, he would get up there, he wouldn't read the scores, and he could be funny, but he could also veer from the nitty-gritty of the scoreboard, and talk about something else beyond maybe the four corners of professional sports. And that's really what SportsCenter became under, with Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann. Olbermann grew up in New York watching Bouton, by the way. That's how he saw him. And so that's, when you say that he became, he rode this through the 70s, yeah, he did. He's always a guy who was kind of felt he was untethered, but once Ball 4 came out, he was really untethered. People wanted him because he was untethered to convention. He'd piss a lot of people off along the way. People who demanded things to be done a certain way. But then there were always people who liked the fact that that's not what he was, and wanted somebody who was different. And that's where he fit. You asked about what he thought the reaction of the book was going to be. He told me that he didn't think the reaction was going to be like it was, although I spoke to people who were covering the team in Seattle who said that he spoke to them in '69 and said, yeah, this book is going to be explosive. So it's hard to tell, what, he may have thought that sometimes, but not other times. He knew he had something different. And Schechter knew that they had something different. And by the way, World knew they had something different because even though the editor didn't like the book, he certainly didn't pull it either. He published it. As much as he wanted to bury it, once the excerpts came out, the World knew this was a book that was going to sell some copies. And so, it was I think Bouton knew that it was going to shake things up. I don't think anybody could have anticipated it would shake things up as much as it did. But I don't think that Bouton would have ever written a book that wouldn't shake things up a little bit. I think that's just who he is or who he was. So that's what he was looking to do, and I think he exceeded well beyond his own expectations.
So describe to me then sort of, I guess, the rest of his career, because there were a couple of attempts. Actually, played with the Portland Mavericks, right, in the that documentary, The Battered Base. I can't remember the name of it, but
Battered Bastards of Baseball.
There you go, by Kurt Russell's and his dad and stuff, and that got him another cup of coffee up in the majors and the Atlanta Braves, but it seems to me that the rest of his quote unquote career, right, was warmly embracing yet distancing himself from this game of baseball, right? Almost seems like a love-hate kind of relationship, right? Where, it was almost like a playful sort of, engagement, I guess, with this sport that was, I guess, so good and so, not so good, I guess, on certain fronts to him over the years. He almost became, I guess, to your point, he sort of became, almost sort of a professional vanguard, if you will, to the extent that that's a career.
Yeah, he always loved baseball, and he when he left he got sent down by the Astros in the summer of '70, and then he quit. But interestingly, he kept playing baseball. He played amateur baseball, semi-pro baseball, almost immediately after he quit playing for the Astros in 1970. He always loved baseball. He played baseball up through the early part of the 2010s. He was always playing one type of baseball. He played vintage baseball in the last 15, 20 years of his life. He had a vintage baseball league, but before that, he was in a hardball league, or a number of hardball leagues. He just loved baseball. He just loved to play. He loved to be on the mound, and so I don't think he didn't like the business of baseball. He loathed the business of baseball, but he loved the game itself. And so he, unlike a lot of people, I think, where maybe the distaste of the business sours the entire experience, he was able to separate the two. As much as he disliked the business of baseball, that didn't prevent him from enjoying the game itself. And there's no other reason why he would still be playing semi-pro amateur baseball in his 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. You don't do that unless you love it. And he just loved it. And up until the end of his life, until he got too sick to do it, he would go out in his backyard and he would throw. He built himself he lived up in the Berkshires, up in the mountains, and he built his own big brick wall in the back of this big yard he had, and he would go out there with a bucket of balls and a glove. And I'm telling you, this glove and these spikes, I got to believe those are what he used when he pitched for the Yankees. They were pretty beat up. He would go out there and he would throw against this wall for work up a sweat, throw knuckleballs or fastballs, whatever he could throw. He just loved to go out there and throw the ball. I mean, to me, that was amazing. See this guy go out there and just because he loved to do it, and work himself up. He put on the spikes, put the glove on, take a bucket of balls, and just throw until he was exhausted.
I also didn't know he was the creator of Big League Chew, which was sort of a staple in my childhood. With bubble gum, and it's sort of shredded. He was he's a character. He was a bit of a Renaissance kind of guy too, if you really think about it. But I guess the real sort of question I would guess is, well, two questions. Number one, do you think Pete Rose ever forgave him? And Pete, if you're listening, I want to know if you said that quote, and I'm not going to repeat it here, but you could read the book that Mitch has put together, and you'll see there's a whole chapter devoted to that and headlined at that. But what do you think Bouton's legacy was? Because beyond all of that sort of drama and that sort of explosive writing, and it just seems like in the sort of the chewy center of Jim's life, right, is perhaps sort of this enduring love, mystical and estranged sometimes as it might have been, with the sport of baseball. And if there's any sort of theme or fabric, it certainly is that certainly ties it all together. But I think in his later years, I think he just kind of became sort of regarded as sort of this, I want to say mythical, but certainly this sort of revered character and maybe representative kind of persona about sports and culture. And it almost like he sort of and I think he neatly and comfortably fit that like a worn baseball glove, ironically.
I think that Big League Chew is interesting to me because it does sum up what his legacy is. Everything he did was a means to connect people with the experience of playing or being a big league ball player. Big League Chew is exactly like Ball 4, because what Big League Chew is it's bubble gum in a pouch that makes you feel like a big league ball player, because you're not going to chew the other stuff, right? You know, the chewing tobacco is terrible for you, but you can put a wad of that bubble gum in your cheek and feel like a big league ball player. And, you know, in that way, it's like Ball 4. It's the sugar equivalent of Ball 4, because that's what Ball 4 was. Ball 4 was a book which you could pick up and you could just, you know, for the days that you sat there and read it, you would really feel like, oh, this is what it's like, or this is as close as I'm getting to a big league clubhouse. And that's the theme for me that runs through pretty much everything that he did baseball related. Everything was a way to connect people to the game that he loved. And so, yeah, you know, he could piss people off. I don't want to minimize that. I mean, in my book, I do talk about that in the book. And he was very, he had a very specific outlook. And if you didn't share that outlook, it could be tough. But there was a purity of his outlook that I think rubbed some people the wrong way. And that could make for a difficult experience. But I do think that the theme that ties him all together, at least baseball-wise, is that trying to make that connection between something that he loved and experienced and something that he thinks he's trying to get other people to feel it, if just a little bit.
Well, look, this now I'll give you a second here to promote, but this book is meticulously researched. You clearly the legal scholar in you comes through, but to solidify all the information that's in here, and it reads exceedingly well, and it's a fun read, and I think it really does sort of, obviously it's a compliment, right? If you're going to read Ball 4 and the sequel that came out afterwards and his revisions thereafter, this is absolutely the compliment to it, because you get a sense of, him as a person, right? Which was before, during, and certainly after that book, right? So I think a lot of people kind of just say, oh, Jim Bouton in Ball 4, it's terrific. But, to understand sort of the fuller picture, I think you'll even appreciate Ball 4, which again, as I said earlier, still holds up, albeit through a modern lens. You would do worse than to read Bouton, The Life of a Baseball Original by our guest, Mitch Nathanson. What are you doing to promote? Obviously harder to do in our current times, but and maybe what other works do you have in mind beyond this, now that you've sort of covered two iconoclasts in Dick Allen and Jim Bouton?
yeah, I got to find another iconoclast, right? I gotta see. I mean,
well, Spaceman Lee is pretty much, I think, done. Has been written about. I don't know. There's probably others out there.
Yeah, you got Kurt Flood and Spaceman Lee. I think those are the two biggies. But yeah, I don't know. I have to think about what I got to do next. I mean, the thing that I'm focused on now is just trying to figure out a way to get the word out about this book, because everything kind of got blown up based on what's happened recently, which of course, in the grand scheme of things, this is nothing. So, don't cry a tear for me, but yeah, there was a whole marketing plan that kind of went out the window. So, hopefully people will find it and read it and enjoy it. Hopefully, that's my fingers are crossed. I mean, if we have more free time, hopefully people will start reading or continue to read and be interested in both Ball 4 and the story about the person who wrote Ball 4 and how it all got put together.
Our many thanks to Mitch Nathanson, a fascinating conversation about a fascinating baseball figure. For sure. The book is called Bouton, The Life of a Baseball Original. It is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. You can, of course, get a copy of it wherever fine books are found. Of course, you can find a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode, number 161, with Mitch Nathanson, and you will find a convenient link that will take you to Amazon. You will get it delivered to you at your door relatively quickly. Buy it at your independent bookstore, perhaps. That's another great way to support your community, as well as supporting Mitch with the book, especially since he's frankly unable to kind of get out there and promote it in person, given the times that we're living in. So, but do yourself a favor. This is a really well-written book, and surprising and fun to read. And I learned a lot about a character, frankly, that I thought I knew a lot about, but I clearly didn't know as much. Now that I have read the book, I feel like I'm close to being an expert on the life of Jim Bouton, and it will allow me, frankly, to reread Ball 4 with a little bit more incisiveness, for sure. If you want to follow Mitch and his work and the promotion for this book and all the other stuff that he does, you can follow him on his website at mitchellnathanson.com. That's Mitchell, Mitchell, Nathanson, Nathanson, mitchellnathanson.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at Mitch Nathanson, Mitchnathanson, at Mitch Nathanson. Of course, if you want to follow us, well, God forbid you check us out and bookmark our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can follow us on social media, of course. On Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. On Facebook, you'll find a page devoted to us too, by golly. You want to send us some email, you can do that too. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And of course, on the website, you can sign up for, just find the link there, our little weekly newsletter that we'd like to send out every weekend to kind of give our most loyal listeners a bit of a heads up of what we're going to be talking about each week. A little bit earlier than sort of the average Joe out there waiting for the RSS feed to ping their podcast catcher and get the episode that way. However you connect with us, we appreciate it. And we also, of course, appreciate our good buddy Jerry Payne Audio Excellence, for his technical gymnastics this week, as he does each and every week, and has been doing for every single one of our stinking episodes. I can't believe he's lasted with us for this long, and he hasn't run away screaming. But he's hunkered down there in his homestead in suburban Atlanta, and we appreciate him doing everything he can to get our show out there in the ether, and hopefully, again, offering a little bit of distraction, a little bit of frivolity in the dark times that we find ourselves in. We, again, thank you for all your support. We thank you for listening. And let's see. Oh, yeah, we got to leave you with something, of course. Couldn't find a really big song, but you heard us talk, Mitch and I, in this earlier conversation about some of the things that Jim Bouton did during his, I guess, his post or his ancillary baseball career. And one of those things as you heard there, was, yes, a very briefly lived primetime television show, a sitcom at that, and it was called Ball 4, of course, and it starred Jim Bouton as, his character was called Jim Barton. Yeah, really a real stretch there. But for 5 episodes, yes, count them, on CBS, in 1976, it was on the 1976 fall season schedule, but it only lasted 5 episodes. Here is the theme song. Yes, the theme song. The opening credits to the short-lived television show Ball 4. And until next week, take care, everybody.
Dear Lenny, today we held batting practice in a hotel room. The bill came to $482.
Well, you just might wonder why I'm playing games when people my age are mostly settling down. You got to understand it's not the same as being in the stage or simply running around. There's a boy in me who comes alive each summer. Won't you come play ball with me? Let's have fun, we're not keeping score. Laugh a little, cry a little on me. That's what I'm playing ball.